Hello, builders of good. Thank you for tuning in to the Build Good Fundraising podcast. Fundraising isn't easy, but it should be simple. So on this show, we take the mystery out of raising money. Now, on every episode, we coach you to build your fundraising like a flywheel. The flywheel has 5 steps. Number 1 is listen. Number 2 is engage. Number 3 is ask. Number 4 is celebrate every gift. And number 5 is report back in a responsive and timely fashion. If you master these 5 parts of the flywheel, your fundraising flywheel will start to spin reliably with less effort on your part. Your revenue will grow, and so will your career. Now, every week we focus on one part of the flywheel, and today we are focusing on listening. And we've got Justin McCord with us, SVP at RKD Group. You know, as fundraisers, we're really good at thinking through how we should talk to donors. We've got ideas for campaigns. We've got ideas for emails, for messaging. Especially those of us who are like fundraisers and marketers, that Venn diagram, we just love thinking about those kinds of things. But we're not always the best listeners. And in our chat today, we're going to talk about a study that RKD did that showed that actually donors need us to listen to them a whole lot more. So we'll get into it with Justin. He's an award-winning podcast host. He also has a fundraising podcast. He's a strategic leader in nonprofit marketing. And at RKD, he oversees the brand and he also leads the firm's research efforts. He's also a nerd for soccer, professional wrestling, and dad jokes. So that's one Venn diagram that you might not find anywhere else. We've got a unicorn in our midst.
Trying to give all the data attributes so that can be appropriately personified.
That's right. So in our conversation, I can now treat you for who you are rather than just your gift history. I have a little bit of data points to work off.
Yes.
Yep. All right, so here's our conversation with Justin. Justin, thank you for coming on.
Absolutely, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. We've been in each other's spheres now for some time and have had a chance to chat. And I think we've both seen each other's podcast efforts grow. And so I'm coming to you all from Dallas, Texas today, but follow and am a fan of Mike and the Build Good team and what you all do. So thrilled to be here.
And if you're not in the room with us on Zoom right now in BG Live, Justin is looking spiffy. I gotta tell you, he's got a suit. He combed his beard. He's on it today.
I did. Yeah. Special day, Mike. It's a special day.
We had your CEO Tim on during COVID, and we've been meaning to have you back on. And when this study came out, I thought it was a perfect fit for what we talk about on the podcast. So generally speaking, broad strokes, most nonprofits in the US and Canada and the UK lose about half of their donors every year. That's kind of average. There's some who do a lot better than that. There's some who do a lot worse than that. But generally speaking, that's a number that's kind of stubbornly remained the same for a few years. And part of that is natural. Part of that is also just distinguishing between fundraising and donor raising activities. But I think we can all agree, like that could be better. And that's one of the things that you set out to find out with the study. And you went out and you talked to a bunch of donors. So let's just give a bit of context for the study. What was your aim of the study when you went into this?
So I went to university at Baylor University, which is in Waco, Texas. And on the campus of the university, there are these swings. They're painted the colors of the school. So green and gold, like porch swings hanging from trees. And there's this really interesting kind of cultural dynamic around those swings is that oftentimes you would see a couple sitting on those swings, and you knew if a couple was sitting on one of the swings, they were having what was referred to as a DTR, a define the relationship chat. That was the moment that they figured out each other. And met my wife at Baylor, did not sit on a swing to have said chat, but know plenty of people that did as a part of that cultural norm. And so I used that as a setup for the research study My team was sitting in a room as we were able to come back together, post pandemic, and we were really struggling with some of the stats that you shared earlier, just those retention rates, or the idea that we accept that first year retention rates might be at 30 to 35%. So we're going to go through a lot of efforts to acquire 10 donors and then just accept that 3 are going to stay and 7 are going to walk away. Or that in the US, over the course of the last 23 years, you've had 20 million fewer households giving. Like, these things just, they don't feel right. And it feels like there's something wrong with the conversation. And that, as you said, we do a good job, an adequate job of talking to donors, but we miss the aspect of what was so special about those couples sitting on that swing, which was the talking with each other and like having the chance to hear from the other party in their words what matters to them. So that was the impetus, was what would it look like if we started asking donors what they felt, not just why they gave, but like how they think about their relationship with a nonprofit. And that's what we set out to find, was how do they think? And in their words, what do they say about their relationship with nonprofits? And so it turned into a study of a little more than 1,300 donors, people who had given at least $25 in the previous calendar year. And we excluded people's donations to places of worship because the intrinsic motivators to that are somewhat different than that of charitable giving. And so that's the group that we set out to ask them questions about. And in order to get to them sharing vulnerably and authentically their words on how to define it, we actually had to narrow it down, Mike, on exactly what they were thinking about a specific nonprofit. It couldn't be about, hey, how do you think about nonprofits in general? So we first asked our panel of donors to list up to 7 nonprofits that they had financially supported in the last 2 years, and then to rank those on a Likert scale of strong relationship to weak relationship. So then we had this real-time data set from people. Then we sent them through a battery of questions where we reassigned one of their identified nonprofits back to them for them to think about. So amongst our respondents, you had some responding thinking about a weak relationship, some about a medium so-so relationship, and some about a strong. And that's how we could best capture the insights from a donor population. How do they think about relationships with nonprofits that are weak versus strong?
So just to clarify, every donor in the end, they submitted 7 of charities they've given money to. And in the end, you chose one and you gave them that one to think about.
Yeah.
So they weren't thinking about all 7. They were specifically thinking in your context, in your relationship with this one organization.
Correct.
Here's some information that, here's the conversation we're going to have with you, some questions we're going to ask you.
Right.
That's the context for the conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you mentioned donors who gave at least $25. Did this include one-time donors, or were you looking at donors who had a fairly sort of committed relationship with these nonprofits?
So we incorporated both one-time and commit. We did ask about the length of their philanthropic support, but we wanted to make sure that we were getting as broad a base as possible. And in particular, we find that the understanding the perspectives of people who give, be it one time or give regularly, that there are some aspects of their relationship to causes that they are more deeply wed to that are universal. At least that was our theory going in, what we were setting out to understand.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's get into some of the findings. And I want to start with probably the main finding, in my opinion. You can tell me if you thought there was something that was even more salient than this. And it might seem a little bit obvious on the surface, but it's just this idea that at the end of the day, the thing that makes the most difference is that donors want to feel valued. And Oftentimes we make some assumptions about giving. You and I have sat in rooms many times when a CEO or a board chair will say donors they need to know we're trustworthy. They need to know we're doing really good work and that we're really efficient with their money. That's what they care about. And it's not that they don't care about those things, but in your study, donors actually didn't identify those things as some of their top reasons for being involved. They identified things like, I feel like there's good communication that goes both ways. I feel like they listen to me. I feel like they understand my point of view. Walk us through that finding a little bit and what you took out of that. Yeah.
It's so interesting, Mike, the scenario that you just painted where you might have, CEO or executive director of a nonprofit sharing from their perspective what donors care about, that we're being good stewards, that our impact is there, like those sorts of things. That's all about the nonprofit. And I think that this is the thing to where it's a simple but profound revelation. Donors care about themselves. They care about themselves, right? Like they want to feel valued. Mm-hmm. And that's a reflection on themselves and how the nonprofit makes them feel. So it's personalized to them. And I think that that's this really interesting flip of the coin for the way that we think about how we not just communicate with donors, but how we should better understand them. Is the more that I know about someone, the more that I can know what makes them tick. And therefore, I might have a chance at having a better relationship with them.
Yeah.
And broadly speaking, nonprofits are good at this with major donors. They're decent at this with like mid-level. Mm-hmm. And then I think that we're not so good. All of the statistics would say that we're not so good whenever it comes to our kind of our mass market, regular donor. And so, the findings are based off of their feelings, and feeling valued. The more that you can make someone feel valued, the higher their belief becomes in the relationship and therefore in the cause. And belief is directly tied to long-term loyalty.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, I'm sure you've seen this, is donors who do feel valued, they will say things like, this is an effective organization. They use my money well. Right. I can trust them. So all those things that we think they don't actually care about that, but they will use it as a rationale later for why they love giving to you. Yeah. Because you've made them feel valued, right? So you do end up there in the end.
You do.
But the way you end up there is not by telling donors how trustworthy you are and how effective you are. Right. It's just by saying, hey, I gotcha. I see you. I'm trying to get to know you. And over time, that's the outcome. Yeah. The one thing I want to get into is, you said donors care about themselves. I've been challenged on this sometimes by people who might say, well, it's a very selfish way of looking at the world. And I just want us to get into that a little bit, because the interesting thing here is that in your study, donors didn't say, I want the nonprofit to do things the way I want to do them. They said, no, it's good communication that goes both ways. Mm-hmm. Okay. So partnership, it's not just about me, the way I want it. But I do want to be part of this. I do want to be an important part of the team, and I want to be seen as an important part of the team. I get that it's a team. It's not donor-led. It is, same with like they share some of my point of view. They ask for my opinion. It doesn't say they ask for my opinion because they're going to do that, but they're signaling to me that they do care about what I feel and how I feel about this and what my thoughts are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're hinting at what is the secondary major conclusion or finding from the study. And so not only is it that donors want to be valued, the donors with the best relationships with nonprofits want to be included. They feel included, right? And so there is a emotive connection between feeling included and feeling valued. I think that that's, something that we've reflected on within our own organization, like that I have to think about for my team, the team that I lead. How do I make sure that they feel included? How do I make sure to understand each of them individually so that they feel valued, because I know that in the end, if they feel valued and included, that will help us in reaching our goals and our objectives. And it's the same thing with a nonprofit's relationship to its donors. It's bringing them in to the organization, not just talking at them. I think that you put it into a great perspective of, having a donor be an ambassador for you and having high trust in you and believing that you're a great steward are all outcomes. Those are all results of other activities that you do that build trust, that build the sense of feeling valued or feeling included, as opposed to, me perpetually saying, we give 97 cents out of every dollar to programs like that. That's me language, right? Versus me proving that to you over time.
Yeah, well, let's get into that finding. So the second sort of biggest thing that you just started talking about is that engagement is one of the biggest sort of differentiators toward feeling involved.
Yeah.
And then that the strongest relationship have the strongest involvement.
Yeah.
What does engagement sort of look like in donors you've talked to?
Right. So there are some things that maybe immediately come to mind, like website visits. So we might think about the fact that, if someone's visiting your website, yes, they're engaged with you. Prospective donors are going to be visiting your website because they want to check you out. Like they're sniffing out whether or not you're an organization that I want to contribute to. So they're going to your about page. They might be reading previous year financials, those sorts of things. They may be looking at some aspects of how programs are delivered. Why would a donor who's already committed come to your website? Like that was the highest form of engagement that they came back to us with. The strongest relationships was that they visit your website. That means that there's something else that they're looking for, that they're continually interested in consuming or participating in the content that you put out, videos and stories of the ways in which you're making an impact. So that engagement on websites amongst strong relationships, 72% said that visiting a website was for them something that they do frequently. A second thing that they shared, which is a little further down the scale, but it's related, is engage with organizations on social media. From an RKD standpoint, we believe that we have crossed over into this space to where connection is now currency. And one of the primary ways that we connect is through social media. Mike, it's how you and I got to know each other, was through LinkedIn. And so that's how we connect with brands. That's how we connect with retail organizations, maybe, or, it's how we understand and the world around us in a lot of ways. And it's no different for donors in the way that they relate to causes. So the higher the engagement on social media, the stronger the relationship between the donor and the nonprofit. The third one that I want to mention, and I find this one to be fascinating, one of the hypotheses that we had going in was, to what extent does knowing someone on staff by first name, being on a first name basis, to what extent does that make a difference in a donor's relationship? And so what we found was that amongst the strongest relationships, 65% said communication with a person on staff makes a big difference. It's something that they do frequently. And so I just find that to be interesting. I know that if I reach out to, Danielle at one of the organizations that I support, that she's going to know who I am. Yeah. That makes me feel valued, right? It makes me feel seen, and therefore it strengthens my bond to the organization.
Yeah. This might be stepping out just a tiny bit of your study. So tell me, we can take a bit of a side hike here if you want to, but we're entering, some people are saying we're entering the human era, right?
Yeah.
So it's AI everything. And so everything human, everything a machine can't do might stand out a little bit, right? Did you look at in your study? So we talked about LinkedIn, social media, DMs. Have you looked in your study? Is that the corporate organizational social media, or is that people that work for the organization, the CEO, leadership, connecting with people on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and building those personal relationships through social media?
So we didn't look that narrowly within, although I'm super interested in that. But to chase you on the branch for a second, I think that if you think about the Edelman Trust Barometer and the 2022 version that showed that nonprofits year over year had lost trust as a public institution, and that businesses are now more trusted than nonprofits.
Yeah,
Globally.
seen as more ethical and more effective and more trusted than nonprofits.
That's a frightening stat. And then if you take that further and you think about, the rise from corporate organizations at trading in empathy, right? So everything from, here in the States, there are sandwich shops that do National Day of Giving. And so they have national commercials where they're giving a portion of the proceeds to local communities. So now all of a sudden, from sandwiches to if I buy Bombas socks to if I buy a Subaru, like across the board, organizations are trading in empathy and hope, which is something that previously nonprofits had, exclusive rights to. And so you're right, like in this human era, to maintain differentiation from nonprofits, I think we have to lean into how the AI and machine and technology space can help us better know people, but it can't replace how we connect with people. And we have to lean further into connection in order to more deeply wed ourselves to those who are interested in supporting our causes.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of small shops in the room. When you're, and I used to work for a small shop. When you're small, you're desperately trying to be big. So it's like everything is from the corporate brand. You talk about we a lot. And then there's like big companies out here trying to be small and trying to appear like the underdog, right? And trying to become a lot more human. And like, HubSpot put out this new video for their chatbot, and it's like Dharmesh, who's like their CTO, like making dad jokes. And that's like a very like authentic sort of video. They're trying to appear like very like raw and human.
Right.
Yeah.
It's an interesting paradox. I think one of the things that stood out to us in the study, and this ties back to the idea of feeling valued, but it's that, as you said, attributes like whether or not an organization is trustworthy or puts the donation to good use or makes a great impact played less a role than feeling valued or feeling important, which means ultimately transparency is secondary to authenticity. Authenticity wins the day. So whether or not you're a small organization or a big organization, donors would rather see authenticity of someone with an iPhone in a scattered space, talking about the real need and the real impact, versus something that's forcing organizations speak of me first, me first, me first.
Right. Yeah. I want to get into the next finding, which was surprising, but also not. And it's kind of a smaller finding. We can spend maybe a minute on it. But donors with weak relationships are more likely to want more communication.
Yeah. It's the theory of alt programming, right? But Mike, there's a lot of these findings that we have related to personal relationships. If you think of the donor that might be reporting this finding as a real person with a real name and a real home and a real family, there are probably people on our file, people who have given to us in the past that might say, yeah, I really liked that health organization. Like I liked what they stood for. And I don't know, I probably would have given again, but they just never connected with me. I mean, it's the same thing that whenever, I call my mom and she says, well, you haven't called me in a couple of days. And my immediate response is, hey, mom, phones work two ways, right? Like you could have reached out, but that's not the point. It's what she was feeling and what I wasn't doing to reach out and bridge that gap. And so I think for nonprofits, we actually have an opportunity, if we're authentic and we're mindful of how we're communicating with donors, to communicate more, as long as we're doing it on terms that give them a chance to communicate back, and for them to also be a part of or in control of how the communication takes place.
Yeah. I was raised to always call home on Sundays, but then it's like Tuesday and my mom will be like, "Hey, you good? Like, I haven't heard from you." I was like, "We talked on Sunday."
We talked 2 days ago. Right, right.
It's like, "Yeah, well, how are the grandkids?" It's like, "Yeah, okay. Well, I gotcha." Yeah, so that makes sense. Have you ever found this? We've sometimes surveyed donors or talked to donors, and they will say something similar to that, which is like, "Yeah, you don't really connect with me. I don't really hear from you." And the org goes like, "I send you stuff all the time." That person hasn't looked at any of it because it just hasn't connected with them.
Yeah.
And maybe the self-reported sort of, they haven't connected with me, or they haven't, or I want more communication. And nonprofit might go like, "I send you a lot." Like, yeah, but maybe it's not resonating. Maybe it's not connecting.
Yeah. It could be hitting them at the wrong time of day,
Yeah.
or it could be the wrong way to communicate with them. I mean, I've got people in my life that I text with and I never call. If I call, it would shock them, right?
Right.
And they may not want to answer, right? Or I've got people that I only use certain messaging platforms, or people that I only call that I would never text. Like there's a way to communicate based off of the person that you're
Yeah.
talking to. And again, it's no matter the size of the organization, that can be challenging to figure out what's the right way to talk to Mike. Like, how does Mike want to be communicated with? And finding that out,
Yeah.
it
And
is a worthwhile endeavor.
and maybe even how you started that relationship, right? So if you start that relationship off right, you properly care for the person, and you invite them in, you welcome them, you make them an important part of the team, they might actually end up reading a lot of your stuff in the future.
Yeah, right.
Because you just set that relationship off with a different expectation,
Yeah,
which is like, here's how I'm going to treat you. And in return, you might reciprocate by being more interested, and by following a little bit closer.
right. Totally agree. I mean, it's about all of this is, because all of this is centered around feelings, it can get mushy and touchy-feely and feel like it takes a step away from marketing. But ultimately, we believe that there are data attributes that can help us understand and connect the dots between these feelings so that you can do it. It just can't replace, like you said, that authentic outreach.
Yeah. Stronger relationships are more likely to lead to larger donations. Another one where you go like, yeah, that makes total sense. And at the same time, we sometimes ignore the people right in front of us who have strong relationships with us, and we
Yeah.
chase somebody who might be able to give a large gift.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Kind
We're
of
looking
ignore
at,
these people right in front of us, right?
yeah. Right. So wealth screening and those sorts of tactics are really good assists. But to your point, you might be ignoring the obvious around you. And we refer to the strong relationships lead to larger gifts as a water is wet kind of finding, right? Yeah, it makes sense, but it's the challenge for, so what are we going to do about it? How are we going to find out whether or not someone has a strong relationship with my organization or they have a weak one, and why they have a strong or a weak, right? So that way we can help cultivate the relationship appropriately. I was having a conversation with a colleague, and we were talking about, he makes a large gift annually to an organization that he's passionate about. He does it at a certain time of year, and it's always tied to wanting miles from a credit card.
Right. Yeah,
And
yeah.
so the amount, although it's typically large, it's like, okay, what's going to get me over the threshold to maintain some sort of a status? But he only wants, like, he doesn't want to be assigned to someone and have them try to take him to lunch or take him to golf or invite him to events. He's deeply committed to the cause. He just wants the communication on his terms.
Right.
And so you would never know that if you're not asking and understanding, hey, how can we relate to you? Like, what brought you to the organization, and what are some ways that we can work together going forward? Would you like for us to send you regular updates on impact in stories? Would you like for us to tell you about special campaigns that we're doing? Getting into some preference-based communication, maybe even as opposed to preference-based checkboxes on communication preferences, right?
Kind of a highly personal thing for some people, right? Communication preferences, but broad picture in your study, did you see a difference in the strength of relationship with different channels?
The respondents to our study tended to indicate that that the deeper their engagement in more modern communication channels, so that would be through digital channels, through social engagement in video, that was more of an indicator of a stronger relationship. So deeper the engagement in more modern channels, stronger relationship. So that's not to say that there's not a place for analog or traditional channels. I think that there is inherent value in those. It's that those things need to work as an ecosystem. I read this quote this morning that the future of fundraising is not about channels, it's about donors. And it's kind of sitting with me as we have this conversation. And just as I think about the study, is that channels are indicators, but you don't know until you talk to someone what they're truly passionate about and how they care to communicate.
Yeah, and it's also just getting increasingly difficult to the errors of attribution are getting increasingly, hard to sort of fix, right?
Right.
We've had, however you measure it, even if you do multi-touch attribution, it's still kind of a gray picture of what's actually happening, right?
Yeah, it is. It really is.
And that might just get harder and harder, not any easier.
Yeah. It will certainly get more difficult if we don't find better ways to tie data together, right? So to the extent that our data is transaction first, we're never going to be able to tie pieces together. And to whatever extent we can capture engagement data, if we're not able to aggregate it, we're still going to see one part of the picture and not the whole thing.
Yeah. When you split up by channels, did you also look at, this might be hard to quantify, but did you also look at like sort of personal one-on-one and just personal phone calls and some of that more fuzzy stuff that doesn't neatly fit into a channel?
Yeah, we tried to blend the two. So, we asked questions around, thinking about a nonprofit. Have you ever watched a video, listened to a podcast, attended an event, volunteered, personally interacted with someone, download an ebook? Like, we tried to ask a combination. And again, in many ways, modern or tech first, digital first communication were the best indicators of the strongest relationships. That's not to say that the others are weaker. It's to say that amongst the strongest relationships, I think that what we ultimately concluded is that when you have a strong relationship, all of it matters.
Right.
There's value in every channel when there's a strong relationship. So you should put an emphasis on building strong relationships so that you can communicate in all the ways, because that gives a multi-dimensional experience for your donors.
Sure. And it's self-reported attribution, right? So you're asking somebody to think about the nonprofits that you have the strongest relationship with, like how do you interact with them? And they're like, oh yeah, social media, I get some emails.
Sure, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you might not think about the fact that, well, actually you go to this event every year and you know this person there and they thank you really well and actually is a very personal cause to you because your daughter has this disease, or there's
right. There's so much more, just even in that sort of a anecdote. It's a much richer picture, and all of those are ultimately data attributes, but it's human data, right? It's things that we may be only able to capture through conversations or through more personal communication that is two-way versus one-way.
Yeah, let's get into that. So how can we transition our fundraising practice to go? So in a flywheel, we start and end with listen. Yeah. So how can we transition our fundraising practice to actually start with listen first?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been saying to our clients, or just asking first, is how do you listen? And then there's this uncomfortable silence. Surveys, great tool. It's a great tool. but you got to do something with the data. Depending on the questions that you ask and the findings that you get from a survey, that may characterize what you ultimately do with the data, but you have to do something with the data, or else you're putting that relationship further at risk by asking someone for something and then never coming back to them and telling them the impact of what they shared with you. So we've been challenging a lot of organizations to think about better use of surveys or considering primary research on their own. Our findings are based off of a panel of donors that are intended to be representative of a large scale population. The findings within an individual organization based off of their mission, their service area, and the geographic placement of their donors could look very different. And so we think that there's value in stepping into research and not making it complicated and not making it so expensive that you can't afford it, but just stepping into some research. So surveys is one area. Research is another. There's an organization that we work with that while they don't do surveys and they don't do research, they do something that I'm a big believer in. And it's a couple times a year, Chief Development Officer orders pizza and has the staff stay a couple of extra hours one night during the week. And they will pull a random segment of donors and distribute them, name and phone number, and the staff calls them. Not volunteers, not outsourced to a third party, which both of those approaches have value. But the staff calls them and says, hi, my name is Justin and I'm with the so-and-so organization. And I just want to say thanks for supporting us. And I would love to know a little bit about you. If you have time, if this is not a good time, it's not a problem. But if you have a second, I'd just love to know a little bit about you. Like, they intentionally start conversations. And I'm fascinated at how that colors relationships between the donor and the organization. So I think that those are three ways that give us scale. Would love to know, Mike, from your perspective, what you see or your experience on improving listening.
Yeah, so we often talk about two kinds of listening, quantitative and qualitative. And quantitative is there's a lot of listening you can do by just in your CRM, just looking at your data. And the thing is, the data will tell you what the data is, but it can't tell you why the data is. Only conversations can do that. So you talked about internal research, and big fan of that, because we're talking about your study here, and I love to look at other studies, but at the end of the day, those are good things to know, good to be aware of. But there's this data set right in front of you. The 1,300 donors you talked to in your study, those 1,300 donors are in somebody's file. There's that data set that you can work with and look at the other studies, look at our KD study, look at the donor effectiveness project. Next After has a bunch of great studies, look at all that stuff, but then do a research project, an insights project with your own donors. And it can be very, very simply 1 or 2 questions, as long as you kind of ask the same questions of every donor and you log those answers carefully. You can ask them to record the call. You can have the call transcribed. And I'm thinking of small shops with not a lot of sort of human power. And the really neat thing is that ChatGPT can actually do sentiment analysis. So there's more and more tools coming out here now where you get all this messy qualitative data. But I truly believe that if you talk to, this is not scientific in any way, I believe if you talk to 10 people and you talk to them long enough, and you're going to find an insight there. So it doesn't have to start with 1,000 donors. You can start with 10, but have a good conversation with them, and you might find some insight. The second thing that we've done for clients is once or twice a year, the CEO sends out a plain text email from the CEO. The subject line is something like, how are we doing? It's a 3 or 4 sentence email, and it just says, hey, Justin, I'd love to know how we're doing. How are we measuring up in your eyes? And again, you're optimizing for reply backs, right? And you say, please hit reply and let me know. I really want to know what you think about us and this relationship. And again, you get a bunch of qualitative data. But you will see patterns and signals in there.
That's it. You'll see patterns and you'll see signals. And that can take you further down the road. It just adds one more dimension of how you can think about or approach making listening a part of the cultural identity within the walls of the organization.
Yeah. Now you have people who interact with the public in your organization, right? It could be, I don't know, different shops call this differently. It could be reception, it could be donor service,
Services,
whatever.
right?
They're your director of first impression, right? Like that's those people. You can train those folks to be listened first.
Yes.
Even when a donor says, "Hey, I'd like to change my address on file, or I'd like to not get any more mail." Most of the time, somebody will answer and say, "No problem, I'll change it for you on file. Thank you." But you just miss an opportunity to ask a question and listen.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And then ultimately, because we've engaged with a fair number of organizations that might have a pretty good practice around, that first impressions team engaging with donors as they come in, but then the data sits on a shelf, a virtual shelf, like it sits somewhere and it doesn't come over to like the annual giving side, which is where our firm works quite often. And I find that to be so frustrating. I mean, ultimately, you're capturing really important information that can lead to new frontiers of connecting with people. You got to use it. You have to find a way to have it come up in a strategic conversation.
Yeah. We've often talked on this podcast about having retention day at your nonprofit, just choosing one day a month. It could be the last Friday of every month. And we got to work that out a little. We got to come up with a framework on what you should do on retention day.
Yeah.
But one of the ideas is like, hey, let's just share some donor stories, some things we've heard in the last month. And then at least we're starting to permeate that information within the org, right? And
Right.
At least we're starting to have that mindset of being listening for donor stories.
The organization that I mentioned earlier, what I really appreciate about the efforts that they go to with, just the calling, the late night call engagements that they do, is that it does create a culture within the organization of them stewarding and not just using that word as some sort of a passive nonprofit marketing buzzword, like actually taking care of the relationships, showing that the relationships matter, and being willing to stay after hours to engage, like those sorts of things. I think that that's a really interesting mindset for the listening audience, or for nonprofits in general, to think about, like, to what extent do we want listening to be a part of the culture of our team in terms of the way that they relate to donors. And then if you can capture that, then it's like, okay, so now what are we going to do? What are we going to do with it?
Right. We're going to take some questions from the audience now. We are live. This is BG Live. We've got a bunch of people in the room. Some of them have been asking questions. So we're going to hand over the mic to Becky, who's been with people in the chat. Becky, what have you got for us?
We've got some great questions. And the first one is coming from Brett. And Brett, I'm going to call you up and ask you to turn on your camera. Hello. And you can ask your question of Justin.
Yeah, hi, Justin. Appreciate the conversation. One thing that stuck out to me is mentioning about donors focusing on how they feel with respect to the organization. And then they sort of later on have the rationale that's intellectual for, why they support. And so I find that to be true in the work that we do with clients. And it's difficult to talk to, or sort of get that message across, as I think you've suggested. And I wonder if you've had any success with the way that you approach this, with perhaps reaching out to the board, the ED, the development department. Is it with just conversations? Is it with, like Loom video recordings, or, training materials, or something else?
Yeah. So you're hitting on a couple of things that we find to be really important. And so that's definitely education to the board level. Whatever organization objectives are, typically start there and then trickle down, right? And so if the KPIs are all about hard metrics around, fiscal, then that can be challenging for some of the things that we're talking about, which are kind of gooey soft metrics. And so you have to find a way to connect those. And some of that comes back to either board or executive team conversations and training on the value. One way that you can definitely extrapolate this out is if you can show the improvement of retention rates based off of investments in listening from 1 year to the next, that all of a sudden your projection model can show that sort of growth. We know that donors who give 2 or more years consecutively are the best candidates for extremely high long-term net value. So it's worth finding out what makes those donors tick. It's worth investing, even if it's a one-time expense or an expense that's, every 2 years, to lean in and find out what makes that particular donor type tick so that we can try and mirror that against a larger file to get more people there.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Fantastic. We have another question coming in from Jennifer. And Jennifer, if you can turn on your camera, we'd love to hear it.
Hi.
Hi.
Justin. Hi, Mike. Thank you for everything. This is great. Justin, I have a question for you. So I started in philanthropy about 3.5 years ago, and I had built an affinity program that absolutely took off, built it from the ground up. We're closing in on 2 million in memberships and additional gifts just in this amount of time.
That's awesome.
It's been amazing. Thank you. So one of the things that I do with all of our members is I put them in a 12-month touch point calendar. And a touch point is anything from 1 of 2 virtual meetings a year to coming to campus once a year to getting an alumni magazine. I mean, some stuff is basic, everybody gets, and some stuff is a little more personal. Anyway, I got some feedback recently from a supervisor that I was potentially setting up major gift officers for failure because I've been engaged with our members to a level that maybe they won't be if they become major gift donors. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I have lots of thoughts. I'm trying to filter some of the thoughts. So first, Jennifer, we would call the theory that you're talking about being promoted to loneliness. That ultimately, we see this many times with donors pulled out of an annual giving file into a mid-level file, that they receive less communication and are expected to do more. So it's like, you're promoted, congratulations, we're going to talk to you less. And that's a recipe that doesn't help anyone. So my encouragement to you is we believe that the old ways don't cut it anymore, that ultimately, especially since 2020, people have changed, the world has changed, the way that people connect with organizations have changed. And so it is imperative that people invest in connection. I know that you've got a challenge on your hands because you may or may not be able to influence your major gift colleagues to take up the mantle for the same amount of engagement. Data can be your friend in helping you prove that point, but I would encourage you to not take your foot off the gas pedal, that building those relationships are going to matter. And in fact, you may be put in a position to ask for some of those larger gifts because you're going to have those relationships with those donors.
Thank you. Yep, that's what's already happening. So I think it's making potentially matters worse, if you know what I mean.
Sorry, I wanted to help, but you're doing the
Jennifer,
right things, Jennifer, by all accounts. You're doing the right things. You're focusing on connection. You're focusing on engagement. You're learning so much about these donors. There's a health system that does an exceptional job at doing this in terms of it's not even like a mid-level giving rep. It's almost like this intermediary consultant in between annual giving up to kind of the major gift level. And, interestingly enough, the model that the organization has put in place is that this rep stays with the person as long as they're on staff and or the person keeps giving. So it's not a handoff to someone who's going to lessen the engagement. It's, I'm your concierge. Let me bring in my expert on, giving major gifts at this level. And so it's a slightly different organization model, but it's helped them overcome that challenge of, certain gift officers being high touch and others being low touch.
That's exactly what I've been seeing. Okay, thank you so much.
For sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. We've got another question just at the end here from Hannah. Hannah, if you would like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead.
Yes. So I know that you've touched on it throughout this whole conversation, which I'm really grateful for. But if I'm thinking about our small shop pals, what are some really practical ways that we can build human connections and relationships with donors, but like at scale? So I'm just thinking of like the fundraising person who's doing major gifts, mid-level gifts, and the annual giving. What are like 3 things you would challenge them on for practically doing this?
Yeah. So 3 ways that a small organization with limited time, limited resources, first would be to dedicate some version of a donor survey and make that donor survey about the donors. Don't make it about you. Right. So that's hard for all of us. We want to make it about ourselves, but make it about them so that you can understand them more. And don't have it back into so that we can better communicate with you. That doesn't feel very authentic. With that donor survey, I would suggest having a video so that the person can introduce like, hey, here's why. Like I wear 6 different hats and honestly, I want to get to know you better. So if you could answer the 4 questions below, that can just help me. So that would be one thing. Second thing would be set aside time with an objective to reach out personally. And don't just reach out to the people who are giving the large gifts. And you know what I find amongst even my own team as we challenge each other to be students of the industry is if you don't set aside the time, it's never going to happen. And the more hats that you wear, the more important it is that you dedicate the time to whatever the practice is. So set aside that time. Maybe it's an hour a month and you're reaching out to a handful of donors just to have a conversation. And if they don't answer, you're leaving a really pleasant voicemail that indicates the appreciation. So that's 2 things that I would say off the top of my head that I would challenge that person to think about.
Very cool.
And we know from Penelope Berg research that leaving a voicemail counts. It counts as a phone call. Donors, when they reflect on it later, it gives them the same warm and fuzzies as a phone call.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are almost up for time. So Becky, I don't know if there's any other questions that are still in the chat. If not, we will wrap this up. Justin, if anybody's listening to this on audio later, where can they find this?
Yeah. So the full study is available at rkdgroup.com/listen up.
And if people want to find you, Justin, and connect on a personal level, not just the corporate RKD level, where can they find a human behind RKD or one of the humans behind RKD?
Yeah. You can find me on LinkedIn, Justin McCord, and I would love to connect with you, love to learn from any of the folks who are listening to this, watching this, and be able to speak into what you're doing and definitely listen to your experiences.
Well, thanks, Justin, for coming on the show. That is all for us today. At the end of every show, I give you a very short action plan based on the scribbles of notes that I've been taking during our conversation. So here is my short action plan for you today, which is your donors need you to value them for who they are. Your donors need you to feel like their opinion matters, like they're an important part of the team. And so if you've got tons of things on your plate, so here's a short action plan, which is pull a list from your CRM, start with 10 donors. That's your start. Start small, and you're going to be stacking wins, but just start with 10 donors, make 10 phone calls over the next 30 days. Just set that goal for you and have some conversations with donors. And you can be very honest. You can even say, listen, I'm calling you because you've been giving to us for 3 years, and I'm just so thankful for that. And I've realized we've never actually had the time to chat. And I wanted to know, why'd you give to this organization? What, is there a reason behind it? Is there, and just like have a human conversation with this person and walk in with an attitude of hands open, listen first, ears wide open. I'm here to just kind of find out more about who you are and why you're connected. And you might find that after those 10 conversations, you are itching to have 10 more, because donors on the whole are wonderful, exceptional people. People who make gifts to charities are extraordinary people. They're in the minority in many communities. So that's it. Talk to 10 donors. As always, thank you for hanging out with us on Build Good Live around the fundraising campfire. If you want to be part of future Build Good Lives, just go to buildgood.com. There's a few places where you can put in your email address. It all goes to the same place, and you'll get an invite to future Build Good Lives. That way you can be in the Zoom room with us. If you're listening to this, you're my kind of people. I'm your kind of people. Thank you for the work you do. I'm your host, Mike Dirksen, cheering you on as you build good in the world.